Well, thank you so much. I I am blown away by how many folks are on the call right now. It's my largest audience. I kind of re-entered the tech space, particularly in social media and kind of producing content during the pandemic. So I haven't had a chance to do an in-person event yet. So anyway, thank you so much for attending this one. Um, so yeah, I'm Stephanie Eckles. You can find me as at 5T3PH about anywhere on the web. Um, Mostly Twitter is where I'm going to be most active. Um, and already mentioned a couple of my projects. These are my CSS related projects if you haven't checked them out before. So modern CSS is in-depth tutorials. Small CSS is kind of snippets pulled out from that, short descriptions, and we're kind of going to walk through some of the content you can find there today, just in a reformatted way. And in style stage, you can actually contribute your style sheet. It's kind of a reincarnation, if you will, of if you're familiar with CSS Zen Garden from a while back. So I'd love to see some new submissions to that. It launched in July, it has over 50, but it's been a little quiet lately. So if you're looking for a new challenge, yeah, I'd love to see some fresh stuff there. I'm a front-end focused software engineer at Microsoft just since October, so that's a newer career experience for me. I've been doing front-end work for over 13 years in a professional capacity, longer than that, tinkering. Um, and I spent a couple years in product, spent a couple years leading a design system, spent over a decade of that time as a WordPress developer in a marketing agency. So that's my background. That's where I'm coming from um, when I'm presenting these solutions today. Um, I have become quite an advocate for accessibility. I was talking to the host beforehand. I just talked to a college class last night about Intro to Accessibility, which was really fun to get on their radar sooner than later in their career. Of course, CSS, generally HTML. This says HTML, CSS, LA, and JS, if you're wondering, and then design systems related work. Just a super quick plug, I do have a workshop coming up in July in partnership with Smashing Conferences. So there's a quick link there. I can drop that in the chat for anyone interested in checking that out. It's early bird registration right now, so a little bit of a discount. And I also just last night, yesterday, I'm going to try out the newsletter thing. We'll see how it goes. But you can expect more of the same of CSS and front-end resources if you're interested in that sort of a thing. Cool. So we'll get actually into what we're going to talk about today. I called this minimal CSS solutions to previously complex problems. And again, this is kind of tipping off of my project smallcss.dev, which is minimal snippets that address these things. So we're going to really dive into modern CSS properties. And if you're confused about what modern means, I think it will start to become clear. It's stuff that's given gained more support in more recent years, or even things that are literally just coming out within the last few months even, but that already have very good support just thanks to browsers being in pretty good shape these days overall. So as I said, yeah, you can see here, we've divided this into a few different parts. Let's go ahead and get our feet wet with what we're going to talk about today. So let's start with centering. A classic problem made so much easier with modern CSS. But quick thing for those of you that may be following me on Twitter, you got a sneak introduction to Ellie Element here. So Ellie's going to follow us around these demos and help us with what we're going to be looking at today. Cool. So I have this set up in a div with a class of centering. So good setup so far, right? And my favorite way to use modern CSS to center an item, which, just a couple years ago, the recommendation would have been to display flex and align item center and then, justify content or justify item center. I don't even remember because I'm going to show you a different way. We're going to use grid instead. So with grid in place, we're going to use one more property here. And that property is going to be place content and center. And we have our centered element. Okay, we're just warming up. But that's kind of what we're going to be demonstrating today, discussing the properties, seeing what they're going to turn into. So there is, if you're interested in the difference between place content and place items, because I've seen a lot of articles that discuss this, talking about place items instead, it's going to become more clear if we add additional elements. Sorry, I have to move my windows around. We're going to add an additional element here. So if we have two Ellie's in here, and we switch this to place items, you're going to see that, and even more apparent if we give ourselves a little more room so we can check out our inspector. Using place items, you're going to have the grid kind of allocate kind of a stretch behavior to the rows that come in here. Whereas back with our place content, it's going to remove that stretch behavior and really smush them towards the center. Cool. So that's our centering. That's our most modern way to do centering. And that one was really quick, but if there are any questions, we can pause for a brief moment for questions about that. And if not, we'll move on to the next section. Cool. So we will move on to a little bit more exciting type of a thing beyond centering, which is intrinsic layouts. So here we go. We've got Ellie in here again. We actually have 3 placed in here, and you can see there's no behavior attached to them. They're just list items that are put in here, is what Ellie's representing this time around. And this is another one you might be a little familiar with, but so we're talking about intrinsic layouts, and that's my containing div. So I've got to dip 1 level in to start attaching my styles. But we're going to again use grid, and our goal here is going to be to align our 3 elements side by side. And so we're going to start with display grid again, and this is going to be our first bit of magic. So instead of worrying about media queries, my favorite thing, the thing that like got me excited about grid, got me to start using it in way more projects, was this single line of code. So we're going to do grid template columns, and we're going to bring in the repeat function. And if you're less familiar, that is going to continue to do the rest of the things we define in this function for every grid element, every grid child that's going to be found. We're going to pass in a special keyword called autofit, and we'll discuss that once we can see what it's going to do. And then use a function called min-max. And this is going to allow us to define a minimum allowed width that our grid elements can accommodate, and then also a maximum allowed width that they can accommodate. I'm going to go ahead and bring in, I'm not going to use too many custom properties throughout this, but I am going to bring one in for our minimum value. And an extra tip here, I'm going to use the CH unit, which is roughly equivalent to the 0 width character in whatever font size that it's inheriting. So we'll use that as our minimum allowed value. So I'm within my min-max function, I've added my custom property, and then we're going to use a unique to grid unit called the FR unit, the fraction unit. Let's go ahead and save so we can see what it's doing, and then we can discuss what has occurred. So we've achieved lining them up, but more than that, that in and of itself isn't too impressive, but more than that, if we adjust our viewport size, when the grid elements shrink to hit our minimum allowed value, it's going to automatically create new rows for that content. So without media queries, we've almost created container queries here. It's not quite, the behavior that's coming down that's going to allow you to be more explicit about that behavior, but it's pretty magical. I use this all over the place. And of course we can add a grid gap in here as well to space our Ellie's out a little bit. Now we can achieve, looks like, is there a question in the chat? Oh, talking about benefits. Yeah, it depends on your scenario. So everything's going to depend on your scenario, right? So if you do need more control over that breakpoint behavior, then absolutely you would still continue to use media queries. But there's definitely options or opportunities to use this behavior when you're not too worried about the alignment. When the grid, like sticking to the true grid, is great. But we're going to show an alternate solution that uses flex that will give you a slightly different behavior in case this behavior of continuing to strictly align to these grid cells is not quite meeting your needs. We can switch and instead use flex. So I'm gonna leave what I have here as comparison. We're going to switch our display behavior to flex. We're going to go ahead and let it wrap so that we don't obviously have it not wrap on us. Grid, right here actually is our kind of first differentiator between grid and flex. Is flex without, or excuse me, grid without something like this is not going to have a separate property to indicate that it should wrap. And so let's see, let me save real quick. So on save, we're kind of back to it sort of appears like normal block behavior since we've given it wrap and we haven't told it anything else about how to deal with the width of those children. So let's give those children some instruction. Oops, is that, yep. And we're going to dive into the children. We don't really care what they are in this case. And we're going to assign them flex behavior. So we're going to assign them a flex grow of 1, a flex shrink of 1, and then here we're going to bring in that handy variable that we created to apply the same minimum width that we used on our grid items. And let's see here. Of course, something didn't quite work for me. I was telling the host, I said, this is going to happen to me. I'm going to hit something, I'm going to miss it, and it's not going to work. All right. If anybody spots what I missed. Flex direction should already be row. I may have accidentally done something in my other style sheet that's preventing this. So let's come out here and look and inspect it. All right. So we have our display wrap. We have our Ellie out here. Oh, we did. I overwrote it accidentally. There we go. I did mess myself up in my other style sheet. So there we go. I had to remove an extra width that was in there. So flex is going to give us, and I probably still have something in there. That's the danger of using too many style sheets, guys. All right, I may not be able to resolve that quick enough. But the behavior that we were looking for there, I'll actually go out to, we'll go out to the small CSS that I mentioned because I know I have represented there. That way we don't lose the idea that we're talking about. So here's the, here's our small flexbox grid with the same behavior that we had before, what we were trying to demonstrate here. But instead, when we hit that minimum, you see that last item is still going to take up the full remaining space rather than adhere to that strict grid. So that's going to be our difference between these techniques when it comes to grid versus flexbox. So here's the same thing we were doing before with grid. You can see how that behavior is different between the two options we have. Looks like there's just kind of some general chatter, but if there's any questions about those, sorry for the errors there. Otherwise, we can move on to the next section. Autofill. A little more similar. So the question is autofill versus autofit. Um, a little more similar, but you're not going to get in grid, you're not going to have a intrinsic way to force that item to fill the whole width like we have with flex. It's going to still be within the grid, so you'd have to assign it. You could do that with last child, but then you're starting to kind of augment this inherent behavior that you can get using this method. If that made sense. That was Simon that was asking about that. Cool. So, cool. Sounds like it answered that. So the next section we have, unless there's any additional questions on that grid behavior, and as you saw, didn't mean to pull this up quite as quickly, but you can go kind of check that out, explore it more out on small CSS, both the grid and the flexbox are the first two items that are explored there, as well as the centering one that we already looked at. Cool. We'll move on then to our algorithmic spacing. So you can see already that Ellie's arrangement has changed. Let me get my class started here. And our goal with this section, or our first goal, is that we'd start to like to add some spacing between elements. We're not going to use grid this time. It doesn't quite maybe fit our purpose for this context. So we do want to fall back to margin. So as I mentioned, I have design system experience. I have advertising agency experience. I'm very used to being handed very precise pixel ramps of spacing. Design tokens that represent that might be a familiar term to some of you. And that's great, but we're going to look at how we can enhance that idea and maybe what can go a little bit wrong when we only rely on pixels. So, all right, so again, I'm going to have to do just a little dive into my elements that I know that I have in here. And what I'm going to do is use the adjacent sibling selector, and we're going to use that to apply margin top. So another little thing that we can explore here, use with caution, but let's explore using logical properties as well. So I'm actually, instead of margin top, I'm going to say margin block start. And if you're unfamiliar, logical properties are going to respect things like writing mode. So instead of left and right or top and bottom, in this case, instead of top, we're going to say start. And the reverse of that would be bottom. And again, these aren't quite ready for prime time, but we'll just throw that in as an extra exercise to try out since we're talking about modern CSS. Okay, so in the scenario that I was given this precise pixel ramp, let's say that I was given the value 128 pixels. Cool. Okay, we're, pretend these are like sections of our website. We've accomplished the job. All right, commit, we're done, right? Well, let's hold on a minute. Let's look at that in, make sure this is updated. So let's look at that in the context of a user that is, first of all, on a mobile device. So we'll just use our browser tools to emulate that, right? So at that point, that 128 pixels becomes quite a lot of space. Do we still need that space? Is it still representing the same thing for us of, defining sections of content? The other area that can become problematic, and this is something that's newer to me in terms of my awareness of users of the web, but related to accessibility, is users that employ desktop zoom. So let's start zooming in here. So here's 150, 200, 300, and 400. Now the reflow guidelines, I should have put a note to myself about the success criteria there, but it's called reflow from the WCAG success criteria guidelines, state that we should accommodate up to 400% zoom. 400% zoom at a desktop width or viewport width of 1280 pixels is going to be representative or roughly equivalent to what you get at a mobile, like a iPhone portrait size. But of course, we have a completely different aspect ratio that we're dealing with when we're talking about desktop zoom. And since there's no media query right now that allows us to attach to Zoom, we need to handle this with some other methods. So that's what we're going to look at. So as you can see, at a 400% zoom, that 128 pixels becomes almost half, maybe even slightly more than half of this viewport at this aspect ratio. So let's see how we can improve that experience. So reset our zoom to start with. So the first thing you may, think is, okay, I know how to do this. We're talking about height. I can deal with height with viewport units. So let's get our margin block start. Let's override that and let's try out 15 view heights. Okay, so on our kind of normal desktop view, it actually, if you saw it quick enough, it jumped a little bit higher than our 128. And let's go out here so we can see it better. And we'll do our mobile again real quick. And already that's a little better than what we had before. Making sure it's, for some reason, my inspector is not picking up. Oh, because I use adjacent sibling selector. That's why my brain was on grid. Okay, so it's improved it. It's shrunk it a little bit more, so that's an improvement, and so let's try zoom again. 200. So we're all the way up to 400. And you could argue that that's, desirable. We've at least shrunk it so it's no longer taking up half the viewport height. So it is an improvement. We can take it one step further. So if there was a reason that you had that space in there, right, to delineate sections of content. So that's a really purposeful reason. So we're not just about, shrinking that space. We want to keep that context. So you may have been wondering why I've called this algorithmic spacing. So far, we've definitely not introduced an algorithm here. So let's do that. So instead of our pixel value, our view height value, we're going to introduce the CSS function of max. And let me zoom out. So our max function is going to dynamically select the larger of the computed value of the values we pass into it. So we're going to pass in two values in this case. So it's going to be dynamic, and that's where our algorithm idea is going to enter. So we can go ahead and continue using our 15 view height as one option. So if it's the greater option, it will still be chosen. But we'll also accompany that with 4 rem. And I've saved, you don't really see a difference here because so far 15 view heights is the max between those two computed values. Where we're going to see it is when we get back up to, so I'm at 400. If you watch that again, I'll go a little slower. That's at 200, 300, 400. So you can see that the kind of contextual view of this is that at 400%, that 4 rem is actually now computed to be greater than the 15 view height. So it's a small tweak we can make. It's a complement that we can select to assist us in this kind of circumstance because we don't have a Zoom media query. So definitely we can pause if there's any questions related to that. So margins are great. That's a definitely a reasonable use case that we have to deal with. But if we change up Ellie and we now have some text to deal with instead of our, just blocks of content. And what we'd like to do with our text is allow some space around the content. So we'll change up our selector, and it's now we've just got paragraphs that are inside of our LE containers. And in this case, we want to add padding. So we're going to choose another logical property again, padding inline. So this is going to set both what we would have thought of as left and right padding at the same time. And our pixel ramp that we've been delivered says, okay, this is 24 pixels. Okay, that's, that's reasonable. Might have to throw an important on here. I think I'm overwrote it again in my style sheet. Yep, sorry about that. Ignore the important, just for purposes of my demo. Okay, so 24 is fine, but these are pretty large content areas and it doesn't actually feel fine within the space. It feels like we could use a little more room since we have a little more room. So let's duplicate that. We're gonna probably see a pattern here. We're gonna try out viewport units instead. So we'll switch to view widths. And yeah, that's an improvement in terms of, feeling a little more relative to the content being of larger width. So, definitely an improvement. We can, oh, but now I've actually just changed my aspect ratio and that 5 view widths is pretty large. Like that feels wrong again now. But that 24 would have felt way, way too small in this context. So, and we're gonna experience a similar thing as we start to zoom in. And on mobile and Zoom, the 5 view widths is still probably feels okay. But in order to handle those scenarios of it being fine on a larger viewport versus a smaller viewport, this is another scenario where you might reach for media queries to adjust that value, which kind of ruins the beauty of bringing in a viewport unit, right? If you're still having to fall back on media queries when your intent was to make this dynamic. So let's look at what we can do instead. So we'll duplicate this line. So make it a little faster here. And instead, we're going to bring in the CSS function of clamp. Now, clamp is going to, bring up my node again. Clamp is going to allow setting a minimum value, an ideal value, and a max value. So it'll always take in 3 values for clamp. Let's see how we can use that to our advantage. So first, we'll set our minimum value. As a personal preference, if I'm the designer, I tend to use rims for pretty much everything. So I'm going to use 1 rim. And then we can go ahead and we could bring in a viewport unit. Let's try that first. And then we'll set a max value of 3 rim. And okay, I'm going to resize my viewport here. And even as we get wider and wider here, it's never going to be larger than that 3 rim. And as I go ahead and shrink my viewport, it's going to start to decrease that space, but never shrink below 1 rim. So yeah, already we've made, an improvement on how this is perceived relative to our content at any given time. But we can improve this more. So what happens if, we're like, okay, the content's great, but its requirements have changed. We want this to use our, similar to our grid layout that we just looked at. So let's bring in our grid layout to align our, align these. We're gonna have to take off our margin real quick. Okay, so now in this arrangement, when we're still relying on viewport units, now it feels too big again. Now, again, we might want to fall back on media queries to adjust this, but we're losing, especially since we're using our grid behavior again, media queries would defeat the purpose of that layout too. So in this case, instead of using viewport units, we're going to, because we're using padding, this is going to be unique to padding, this behavior being working, we're going to do 5%. And that 5% for padding is going to be computed based on the element's width. So now let me go up to the wider one here. We've effectively created sort of container query padding. which is pretty cool. So on our mobile viewport, it's nice and tight. It feels right for the space. But on our wider viewport, we're allowing it to grow a little bit more if there's room, which again feels more right to the space. There's an excellent question in the chat. Do you educate designers on these possibilities? That is something I'm currently working to do, to find out how to do that. So far, my method is to gently push back and ask if there's a better way. Occasionally, I've been known to sneak in a clamp, actually in this exact scenario of padding, where it's just too much on mobile, you know? Um, yeah. So, we can test our Zoom again, and you can already see massively that the difference that that's making. Um, and again, it just feels more right to the space. Still not a media query in sight. I'm not anti-media query, but we're here to talk about modern CSS and what it offers for you, and some new techniques to put in your toolbox about this. So that's our algorithmic spacing section. Is there any questions before we move on? And certainly if you think of something, we can always revisit one of the demos at the end. Awesome. So we'll go ahead and move on then. Make sure everything on my windows reset. And of course, the Zoom thing pops down in my way. There we go. All right. Am I talking too fast for anyone or any problems hearing me? Okay, thank you for the feedback. Awesome. Okay, let's see. So our next group, so we talked about spacing. So let's now talk about sizing. Ellie's back. Okay. I'm going to cheat and grab my selector from my copy paste. Okay. So again, we've been given a hard pixel value from our design team that our elements here should be a width of 500 pixels, which of course works. This is going to work, up until we get to a viewport size. So on the converse of max that we just looked at is also the function of min. So rather than choosing the largest computed value, min is going to choose the smallest. And so in this case, we could still pass in 500 pixels as an option. So in larger viewports, it's going to choose that 500 pixels. But in order to account for our smaller viewports, or as we saw, a high zoom level, let's pass in 90%. So as we shrink down, we're going to guarantee, what this is like a huge benefit right away is we're going to guarantee not encountering overflow, which again is kind of a classic CSS battle, right? So we're going to prevent overflow because, and actually, let me switch to DevTools so I can shrink it down further. It's going to choose 90% in this case because that is smaller than 500 pixels. So this is a really great utility I've started using a ton in my own work of, your classic container class or wrapper class, whatever you like to call it. So now you're not dealing with specific breakpoints. You can just have the browser handle it for you. Let's see, but we can improve it even more. So I mentioned the CH unit earlier. And so when it comes to, and actually I forgot, let me switch to add some text in here. So when it comes to, more text-based things, it can be nice to limit the width to like if you think of reading lengths, you've probably heard different guidelines, recommendations on reading lengths. So we're going to bring back in our CH unit. We're going to do it a little bit large this time. And accompanying our CH unit, we're going to do a little bit of extra math. So you possibly have used calc in the past to perform math in CSS. But within the min, max, and clamp function, we don't need to also include calc. We can just do whatever operation in that function. So in this case, I'm going to set that the alternative option to ADCH is going to be 100 view width minus 2 rem. So I'm going to save and see what happens there. So on our larger viewports again, it's tapping out at 800, or excuse me, 80ch. And then as we shrink, it's switching to be based on the viewport. And the reason I did that minus 2 rem is an alternative to adding padding to my body or an additional wrapping container. So this is actually my new go-to for my literal container wrapper class is this method here. Pretty nice upgrade. Was pretty pleased with being able to do that and drop some media queries. I can see some nodding across projects. Pretty magical little line of modern CSS. But let's switch our context here. Awesome. I'm glad that the fact that min can do calc without calc was like a woo moment. I more recently learned that as well. And yes, it's very, very handy to be able to succinctly do this without also nesting calc. Okay, so let's switch our context, like I said. And instead, what if we have short content? So now that ADCH is too much. Again, if you follow me on Twitter, you may have already got a hint at what we might do next. I couldn't keep it to myself because it's my absolute new favorite value. So in this case, instead of basing it on ADCH, which is too much, we're going to use an extremely magical, I don't say that lightly, I really mean this is magical, value, which is going to be fit content. And we have what we wanted, which is the effect that's just happened is that fit content will use either what essentially computes to the max content width, but also whether that's the content itself or the max width that it is allowed, like if it's nested in another container. So let's go out here so we have a little more room to look at that. So again, when it got knocked down to mobile, again, I've prevented overflow with just one property. A unique thing about fit content is that it can also be used within a grid context. And in a grid context, it's going to be used, sorry, I'm going to copy paste this in real quick. And within a grid context, it's going to be used as a function instead. And I think I need to switch my context a little bit here. I think I forgot to reset up my demo part of this, but in a grid context, we can use fit content as a function instead, like I mentioned. And in this case, you can see I've nested my min. And so we've taken advantage of both behaviors where we're still supplying it a max content. In the grid context of a function, we're supplying it a max content that it can go. So instead of relying on the content itself to figure out what the max content would be, we can explicitly set what that max content should be that fit content allows things to grow. I feel like I said content a lot there. I'm sorry, I don't have a demo set up to show this, but I wanted to mention that there's two contexts for fit content. And when used outside of grid, we don't have that function available. So instead, we'll go back to our more extended text example here. So in this scenario, fit content is again too much. We still want to set a max, so we can still continue to fall back on a max width behavior idea in this scenario. So you can still successfully use both together. So for instance, if you're not sure how long that content's going to be, I've started applying it to block quotes, for example, that I set a background color to. So that way it's not spanning the full width if it doesn't have to. It still will shrink down, but if there is more content, it's still allowing it to continue to grow. So rather than applying it as the width to max that out, we'll go ahead and fall back on our standard max width, and we get the same behavior. Again, if I go back to note style, that max width is not going to matter here because the fit content is already taken care of handling that for us. I see a question, can I put fit content inside min-max clamp? I don't know off the top of my head if that is valid or not. So if anybody knows in the chat, please feel free to add that. Just scrolling to the chat really quick. Do you prefer width min over max width? Maybe I just answered that question. Let me know if we did by showing this arrangement, how they can work together. All right, I'm resetting here so I can do our next idea. So we have a few more things to look at in algorithmic sizing. Let's look at a few other things we can do. So get away from min and max content. We've mostly just talked about text up until this point, but obviously other types of content exists. And so let's, instead of our little note here, let's get ourselves some more structured content. Let's pretend this is kind of a card, if you will. And so in this case, we're not as worried about the width of the element. What we're going to be worried about is the headline in here. And, I think it's set to, I'm just using the browser native styles of our headline, but more likely you would be given, a defined ramp. And as you explore and resize this, you can hit issues of overflow caused by this headline, just being a larger font size. Some of you may know where I'm going with with what we can do with this next trick, but we can instead bring back our clamp function to make this headline font size relative to the viewport in this case. We don't have the ability to set it to something other than viewport right now. So as opposed to our padding function where we were able to use percents, that unfortunately won't work in the context of a font size. It's just the percent's calculated in a different way. So instead, we're going to use clamp. And as we already looked at with clamp, we can set a minimum, an ideal, and a maximum value. So I'm going to drop in some custom properties that give us that initial setup. Forgive me, I should have written down who kind of coined this term, but it's kind of been shared as the idea of fluid type. And so that's where my naming convention's coming in here. And so let's get our clamp in here and we'll see how it applies and then we can talk about it. So in our clamp, we're going to set our minimum value. And then we're going to do a little bit of it. Whoops, it keeps getting in my way. We're going to do a little bit of a trick here where instead of using just this target 5 view widths, we're going to add that to 1 rem. And the reason here is that for accessible compliance, we need to make sure that we're allowing the user to do browser zoom, and in particular to resize up that text at least to 200%. And if we only rely on view width alone, sometimes it doesn't allow it to achieve that, especially as we think about various screen sizes. So 1 rem will allow us to do that more consistently. Okay, so I've saved, you've seen this apply. And since we're on a larger viewport, it's quite large text. It's probably all the way up to, what did we set it at? 4 rem. But as we shrink it down, the H2 is going to, relatively to that 5 view widths, it's going to resize itself. So this is one to be a little careful with, like I said, because of the accessibility implications. And it may be one where you still ultimately bring in media queries and get a little more precise about it. But still a good, concept again to have in your toolbox. Looks like there's no questions yet on that technique. So let's again change our context and let's give ourselves an image to work with. So images, you may be familiar with kind of doing the, obviously you can already see it's busted out of my container. I haven't applied any styles to this. And so what we can already see is that one thing you may be familiar with doing is at least setting a width on this to at least start to control its behavior. Let's do that. We're at least back in our container now. But obviously, so this is coming from Unsplash. It's just a random image. It's loading whatever size it is. I have no control over it. And as I said, I come from a WordPress background, and the idea of making themes for clients when you definitely can't control what content's coming in there, no pre-optimization or cropping, that used to be kind of hard to deal with CSS. And oftentimes, a trick that I used tons of times in my career was to switch how I was applying it, not let it be a flow image, and switch it to being a background image so that I could do background size cover or things of that nature to control this image size. The first improvement we can make, though, is instead, if we did want to set a height on it, we already know what's going to happen. It's going to squish it in this case. That's not obviously ideal. So the first modern property we can bring in, and this one's been around for a while. I've discovered, though, it has kind of low awareness. So I definitely want to bring it up. We can say object fit cover. Let's kind of play with that. So if you're less familiar, this is going to essentially now define the image itself as its own container and act very similar to our background size of cover. So if you recall that, this image originally was, portrait size image. We shrunk its height and we've defined cover. So now it's automatically being centered in that, in its own image. Like there's no extra div here. It's all within the image itself, which is pretty powerful behavior. This can get us a long way. But you may know where I'm going next. We don't have to include the height anymore. Now, initially, this is going to go back to the portrait size we had available. But instead, our most modern upgrade that we can make, which is still a little too modern, I think it's in Safari Technical Preview now and officially in Chromium browsers, but we can, instead of relying on a height, we can switch this to aspect ratio. And the beauty of aspect ratio is we just define it as a fraction. There's no special other behaviors we have to add in here. So I've defined it as 4:3. And object cover, so we'll just comment that out real quick. Object fit cover is still going to be a good idea to add in when you're doing this kind of thing. Again, if you can't rely on, defining the image size ahead of time, which would also kind of defeat the purpose of adding aspect ratio. But yeah, so these work together really nicely. Aspect ratio doesn't only need added, or it can apply to more elements than images. Images is probably where it's going to be used frequently. You can also think about video embeds and not having to do the padding hack anymore, and instead doing a 16:9 to get that behavior. So for example, we can also do like 1 and get a perfect square, which of course is going to be a little high for my my context here. With that said, though, in that case where you know that may happen, where it's still going to exceed, you still might want to throw a max height on here. I have it in grid, so that's why that's going to work for me. So in that case, it's going to fall back to not quite using the aspect ratio, not picking that up necessarily, unless the other dimensions let it. But the object fit will kind of help cover us still on that changing ratio. this is also still kind of necessary, as I said, since aspect ratio is very, very new and not quite yet supported. So you can kind of progressively enhance to aspect ratio, but maintain use of max height and still get a similar experience across browsers and go ahead and start using it. Why doesn't the image cover all? I believe because I have this set to an aspect ratio as well in my other style sheet, asking about the extra space on the top and bottom here. Let's see. I think that's the only question I see in there. Got to rearrange my windows. Okay. I see someone say with JavaScript, and yes, I used to use, if you've been around a while, backstretch in like every project ever to handle image sizing. That was a jQuery plugin from a while back. It still is around.
Chris also had a
Cool.
question. He was
Yeah,
asking, would you use this as a replacement for background image?
you can. So excellent question. So back to, we've been talking about accessibility throughout this. And what's really great is if you have an image that is not just decorative, you want it to be part of what's understood, and therefore you want to add an alt attribute so it can be perceived by all users, then yes, you could start to bring in these techniques to help you in places where you might have previously been using background image. I've started doing this again in kind of like the card context of, you start with your image at the top of the card, and definitely used background image a lot in the past for that. But now, especially with object fit being available, I definitely would suggest moving to that versus background image. Again, if it's going to definitely be important content for users to be aware of. Oh yeah, somebody chimed in with semantics. Yep, exactly. Semantics and related accessibility. Yep, native lazy loading, really good point on using actual image. Yeah, that one's newer to me too, and I in my personal projects don't use a ton of images, so I'm a little behind on some of the image optimizations that have come out. But yeah, a really good call out about native lazy loading. Yep, and using picture and source set. So lots of advantages for sure to moving to an image versus background image solution. Cool. Just taking a minute if anybody has any other questions. I know we're right at an hour. My next sections are definitely shorter. um, I don't know if we want to do like just a 5-minute bio break, or if since we've been at an hour here.
I would guess we are fine, but
Good. Okay. Good deal.
yeah, let's
All right.
go on.
um, So just a quick reminder, I don't have everything out here on small CSS, but if you haven't quite got notes as we're going, but I'm pulling, or small CSS represents a lot of the functions that we've covered today. Different contexts than some of the things we looked at. Here's the responsive padding that we looked at. Here's an aspect ratio gallery. So this would be another place you can for sure refer back to. I'm also always super open to more ideas of what to cover. I have a couple in the works, so it will be updated in the near future. But okay, looks like not any questions came in. Okay, so our next awesome selection is super selectors. We've already preloaded up here with an article. Okay, you can probably see that we've applied our reset and destroyed any margins that are happening here. And now there's definitely a few ways we could approach this, but we're in the super selectors section. So we're gonna bring in the quite new, in terms of newly supported, selector of is. And the magic of is that we can define multiple elements to attach our rule to without separating them as we used to do, still do, on their own lines. So in this case, we'd like to add some margin bottom to our heading elements. So, you know, just to help illustrate it a little bit more, we could do H1, we could do H2, and we'll give it a margin bottom of, I like to do things relative to M when I'm talking about font sizes. And obviously that completely works. But let's upgrade our solution here, since that's what we're all about today. And it still works at, we can leave it there. So it's our fallback. But instead, within is, we can define both our H1 and our H2. We'll comment this out just so we make sure we know that it really is applying. And yeah, I saved, there's no change. I'm in Chrome, so it's working for me. I checked just the other day. I do believe it's in technical preview of Safari, so super close. And for something like margin bottom, something that is good to have, but won't necessarily harm users if it's not in place, I would say go ahead and use this today. If you still need to, again, you could continue to fall back and continue to define it separately. Another key thing to know about is, though, when we're talking about the difference between defining our selectors individually or throwing them into is that if we have an invalid selector in here, the rule will still continue to apply. Whereas when you do it in this arrangement and have an invalid selector, the browser will throw out the entire rule. So is this going to start to become sort of a safeguard in these scenarios? Now, not similarly, another important thing to know about is that it's going to take on the specificity of the item defined with the highest specificity. So if I had an item in here that had an ID, then the whole selector specificity, so the rule of applied to all of the things, would be at the specificity of the ID. So a little bit of a gotcha there. To counter that, we can switch it to use a property, or excuse me, the selector of where. And where is always going to have 0 specificity. So you can safely add an ID in there and not bump up your specificity. So 2 important selectors, 2 important distinctions between them. So that said, I'm actually going to switch this back to is for now. And I said it would only take on the highest selector here, which right now we have a very low specificity. But once we start to chain this with other selectors, in this case, I'm going to, actually, I just want my H2, and we don't have an H3, but we're going to throw it in. And I say not first child. And in this case, I'm going to add a margin top equal to 2M. So you saw that jump happen here. Using not, now I've bumped up the specificity again. So the rule that applied in here is going to change. I've now fallen back. I've increased my specificity by adding not. Hopefully that made enough sense to know that once you start chaining onto this, you'll still fall back on some of those older existing specificity rules. But that can be super powerful. I have that in use on, I have a minimal example of document styles. So I have a similar idea in use here, and it just really can shrink these kind of future styles that we're able to do. It's going to make such an impact. It gets really powerful when you have, when you're nesting down a chain, and you previously, if you had to nest down, of course, you're listing those out. Now you can throw them all in an is and really compact things, and I think make it a lot more readable in the process as well. I'm super excited about that one. Again, there's definitely scenarios you can start to use it right now when they're low impact scenarios. I wouldn't suggest using it on, applying grid layout when it's really critical to your site, but soon we can. let's see, I feel like I missed one here. Um, so, oh yes. Okay, so we have is, we mentioned where, um, but the other thing we can do that is new, and somehow I completely missed the news about this a few months ago and sort of rediscovered it as I was double checking my examples here and making sure I could tell you about them correctly, is the not selector has been enhanced in a similar way as is, where you can now list elements within not. So let me throw this on the page and we'll talk about it. Here's what I'm talking about. You can now list within not, and this actually has pretty darn good support. Um, again, to me, this is quite amazing that we can do this now. Similar benefit of is in terms of reducing the lines that we have here. But I just wanted to call that out. I haven't really done anything fancy with it, but call it out that that is now available as well. Um, but we can even go, good question about invalid selector. I forgot to look that up, so I can't answer if there's an invalid selector. I guess we could try it. Um, I guess we could try it. Yeah, I think it failed. Yeah, it did fail. So does not allow an invalid selector. Great question. But the other magic of not, this new enhanced not, uh, is that this is going to be a super contrived example. Just because my demo here is not very complicated. But we can actually, using the asterisk here, we can say that paragraphs that are not a direct child of article should receive this style. So in this case, I have faked this to be possible by adding a div around my content. So that's why it's not a direct child. So since that doesn't match, it adds the class. So this one might take a little longer to kind of ingrain. I had to kind of work with it as I was doing this actually and figure out, okay, what would be a scenario? And this isn't still a real scenario, but anyway, this asterisk is representing the P. So the paragraph not matching this rule, apply the styles. So pretty cool. I'm excited to play with that more, come up with a little bit more practical example of when that can be useful. But that's another new feature of how not works. Okay. Any questions there? Someone's bringing up has. I know that was going around last week. Very exciting, but it's not in any support whatsoever. So super cool. I wish I could talk about it, but it has zero support right now. Look that up if you're interested. Was it CSS Tricks? I think that had the article on has. I could be wrong about the source. Okay, so I'm going to go and we're going to switch our context. And instead of our articles here, we're going to switch our context to some button elements. Oh, and we're getting hit with the, going to just comment out my other selectors since I'm in the same page so they don't apply. Okay, so these are some button elements. And you're probably familiar with, I hope you're familiar with, adding focus states to buttons or other similar interactive elements. Right now I have none at all applied, so that we can go ahead and do that. But we have a couple selectors related to focus that are fairly new, but are definitely having good support. So the first one is focus visible. Let me get my selector set up here. A little more room. There we go. So the difference between regular focus and focus visible is that focus visible is going to ask the browsing device to determine when focus styles should appear. So whereas the standard focus is going to appear on click, which again, I've removed that, but it's going to appear on click and so therefore be visible anytime focus is applied. Focus visible is going to be determined by the browser when it's appropriate. And so often what that means is it will apply when a user is tabbing. So in other words, kind of honing in the context of when it's assumed that a focus should be made visible. So for users relying on keyboard access, visible focus is definitely critical. And so that's the scenario typically that focus visible will be applied. I'm actually not aware of a different scenario. I just know the guidelines say it's kind of up to device. So I'm sure there's other contexts where that make a difference for this. Or that might be something that gets enhanced in the future when that might apply. You can see though, I've still got the regular outline happening. So that actually came back in. Um, so we will, you know, I'm only taking off none because I have a kind of equivalent experience where I'm changing the border style here in this particular scenario. Um, I need to do some more experimenting, or if anybody happens to know, I'm not sure how focus visible or if focus visible is handled in Windows high contrast mode. So that would be a caution. But if anybody happens to know, definitely pop that info in the chat. Oh, thank you, somebody, for linking the has article. Let's see. Okay, so another focus one that we have available instead of focus visible is focus within. And so whereas focus visible is going to be directly off of the element it's related to, as we saw, it acts basically similar to focus itself. Instead, what we can do, and this is not practical, this demo that I'm going to use it for is not practical. The selector is very helpful. We're going to instead switch and say and apply this when, instead of on the button itself, we're going to apply this border style when our containing element detects that a child element has focus. That's focus within. Need to save here. So I've commented it out on our button here. And instead, I've just clicked in and I've added an additional style here. That border style is actually applying to the containing element now, rather than the button elements. So once I take focus off of the button, then the border no longer applies to the container. So it's kind of a parent selector, but only in very unique circumstances that have to do with focus. For a more practical way to use focus within on modern CSS, I have a demo of using it to help trigger a drop-down menu. Would be a little more reasonable, practical example of when focus within is a really great tool. It has pretty good support. You still not want to 100% rely on it for something like a drop-down menu necessarily. So again, a little caution, but getting there, and definitely want to keep an eye out for, progressive enhancement all the way. So any questions about those selectors? Cool. And again, if you think of some, we can definitely revisit that. Okay. Okay. So we're gonna kind of go through these a little bit more quickly, hopefully. Just some quick layout updates. So this first one that we're gonna look at is, so we have a scenario here where we have our nav bar and we have our page, and we want this nav bar to scroll with us. And this is probably one of the more well-known examples that I'm bringing to you today, but we can switch this, oops, probably would help to attach to the nav. We can switch this to position sticky. And if I just do that by itself, nothing's quite going to happen. We also have to accompany that with some sort of positioning property. So in this case, we'll do top 0. And now it might be a little bit hard to see, but I am scrolling down the element and my nav has stuck at the top of the page. I'm always a little hesitant. I think it's amazing that we can do this in strictly CSS alone. Um, I'm a little hesitant to ever recommend it as a solution. Let's see, let's go. Oops. Given accessibility concerns, and especially now that you all should know, if nothing else, you know about Zoom and the importance of that. But of course, at this aspect ratio at 400% Zoom, that's taking up a lot of the viewport. And again, since we don't have a media query to attach to Zoom, this one's a little harder to accommodate for. So you can imagine this menu that I have here is maybe what, like 60 pixels high. And you're probably going to have 56, uh, you know, more real world, you'll probably have a much larger header. So just something to keep in mind and a caution there. It might be something where you ultimately do have to bring in JavaScript or you make a decision to only do this above a certain breakpoint. Just doing my due diligence to caution there while I have an audience. um, cool. So let's switch our demo. We'll do something a little bit different than the sticky nav. Okay, Ellie's back. Okay, so I would like to demonstrate a upgrade to a scenario in which you may have previously used position absolute. Again, I have a ton of times for this particular scenario in my career. So what I would like to do is be able to define where each Ellie goes inside of her container and be kind of explicit about what that position is. Well, rather than using position absolute to move her around, we're going to bring in grid. So let's kick off our new rule here. And of course, display grid alone is not going to change things visually for us. But instead of using what we did before, defining like explicit columns, we're going to use the idea of grid template areas. And in this case, we're only going to define a single grid template area. I'm going to call it the stack. And again, nothing's quite changed because we haven't told our Ellies anything new about what they should be doing here. So the very first thing we need to do is define that they should, all direct children should belong to that single grid area. Okay, so what's happened now is that without anything else going on, based on DOM order, they've collapsed and they're now literally stacked on top of each other. So they've all collapsed into one group. Yeah. And so the benefit of this is that we can now start to use grid positioning behavior rather than our absolute positioning behavior to move these around. So our first thing we're going to do, and we're actually going to use place items versus place content in this case, is to center it. This is just our starting point. So you can see they all moved as a group. Again, DOM order, they're stacked up. And instead, we would like to position them uniquely. So we are going to use nth child as a helper to do this. And the second Ellie in the DOM, we're going to apply place self start. So that shorthand is going to deal with justifying a line at one time. And so you can see it shifted up to the top left. That would be the start position for those properties. And then the third child, we're going to do the opposite and do place self end. So yeah, already that's pretty cool. It's relative to the containing element, which can definitely be beneficial. I've used this and one of, again, on modern CSS, you can find this in use for website heroes. So where you're trying to stack an image and some text. It's on small CSS for placing content over a video. And in those scenarios, we're also bringing back in aspect ratio, bringing back in object fit cover. So again, these types of layout techniques can help you keep semantics and also make your layout behaviors a little easier to apply. Let's add one more thing. We're going to take our first LE elements here and change, break away from, the square that's been applied, which we've applied that with aspect ratio and width, again, in my demo style sheet. So first I'm going to unset those, not relevant to this portion, but we need it to be able to reset the width and height. And now you see that she's filling the container. And because of DOM order, those other two are stacked above. So again, really, really great tool to have in your toolbox. We could change the aspect ratio of our stack if we wanted to. Oh, I might have something in there that's preventing that actually, where my width height is. And so I think I have, that's probably not quite, oh, sorry. How does CSS work? Okay, so I've changed the aspect ratio of the container and I haven't applied any widths on it like we did before. But anyway, you can see how it readjusts the position of the children to accommodate that. So they're still using grid positioning. So they're still getting that benefit versus, again, falling back on position absolute. I don't see any questions that have come in, but feel free to go ahead and add some if you have them. Otherwise, we'll move on to some, let's see, I feel like I lost some of my notes. Oh, I did. Okay, so coming soon is gap support for Flexbox. And you can see I clearly made a different mistake changing this at one point. So gap support for Flexbox is going to be a major layout update that we have coming. It's so, again, super close to support. It's available now in Chromium browsers, maybe, I think Firefox. I think it's been in Firefox for a while, actually. Again, Safaris are rolled out here, I believe. That may have updated in the last little bit here. Oh, I listed it out. There we go. It's in Safari technical preview as of a few days ago, at least. And also coming soon, container queries as an official spec. So they're being prototyped in Chromium. I'm not sure if that status has updated, but anyway, native to CSS, and that will allow us to more explicitly define behaviors as in more of a media query format for container behavior versus viewport behavior. So just wanted to throw those out there to for awareness. Let's see. Definitely conscious of my time here. And I think we can get through, we might cut off just a couple demos in these next two sections. Okay, so our next thing is feature detection. And we're going to look at more kind of focus on the code rather than demo so much, so we can just kind of talk about these behaviors that are coming. So the first one I have here is just demonstrating, let's go out here so we have more room to look at it. So aspect ratio, I've mentioned a few times, it's not quite there yet with support, but we also have the ability to detect that support using the @supports feature query detection. So in this case, what I'm going ahead and using it as my default behavior. And then I'm checking that if it is not supported, we're using that to fall back, like we kind of mentioned, to a height behavior, since we can't rely on the aspect ratio. So here's your, you can use this as the actual fallback. This, you can see the small there. This actually comes from my small CSS example. So instead of pre-building that in, we can instead take advantage of the @supports feature detection to provide that fallback. Now, of course, at supports itself has varying levels of support. So take that into consideration as well if you're using it for fallback behavior. Let's see. I need to switch what's being displayed here. Even with two monitors, I'm having trouble with all the windows of the Zoom being involved. Okay, so our next thing to look at, related to supports, coming soon is support for detecting availability of selectors. So again, this feature detection in and of itself is not quite there yet with support, but when it is, you will be able to detect whether it is supported in the browser. So another, again, an alternate way to check for and start to use these as progressive enhancements. So something to be aware of. It is, I only discovered it when I was double checking myself on the at supports behavior to begin with. And I was like, wait a minute, that wasn't there before. So definitely, again, a pretty new behavior that is becoming available. Next on the list of feature detection is detecting for color scheme. And you're probably pretty familiar with this, but still worth a mention. I know myself, I am still experimenting with it and learning to kind of make it part of how I'm building things. So we'll go pretty quick past that. Yep, dark mode. Easiest dark mode ever. This exact rule. It'll just work. That's a joke. Okay. So next on our list is the idea of detecting whether a user is okay with motion behavior in their interface. There was a really great article this week. It was after I'd kind of gone through this demo, but from Tatiana Mack talking about how to really handle this well for accessibility. This prefers reduced motion. I strongly suggest looking that up for some more ideas. But we're going to use it kind of just on a basic essential level here. So what's happening, and I'm sorry, motion warning, there's a slight pulsing behavior here. It might not come through very good on Zoom anyway. I've tried to slow it down, so hopefully is kind of below a threshold anyway. But Ellie's kind of pulsing in and out. That's just being done with transform and scale. But after that's been applied, Andy Bell has a nice succinct way to do this, but using the prefers reduced motion media query, we're just kind of going to universally find, just reset any rules that have an animation or a transition. Also throw in scroll behavior if you're using scroll behavior smooth. And we're going to, for animations, we're going to, and transitions, immediately jump them to their last state or nearly immediately. You can see it's a super quick transition. So we can actually test for this, like test that this media query is working. I'm in Chrome, and there's this extra menu up here at the top. We can go to more tools and rendering. Let me zoom that part in a little bit. But this lets us test a few things. So actually, let's test color scheme as well, but here's the one for reduced motion. So if I turn that on, now Ellie's jumped to her final, the last state. So the transform of scale up 100 or scale 1, and the animation itself is stopped. So really good one, to, again, to keep in mind for reasons for accessibility. And there's so much more that goes into it in terms of guidelines for motion. But anyway, awareness that that media query exists, I think is maybe still a little low, but growing. So one to bring back to your teams, if nothing else. Okay, any questions on that one? Oh, yeah, thank you for linking that one from Tatiana. Yep. Oh, nice. Somebody has a keyboard shortcut for doing the reduced motion testing. Awesome. Okay, so our next feature query that we want to look at is for detecting touch devices. So kind of going with our theme of trying to avoid media queries, breakpoint related ones, because they may not always be quite what you're actually looking for the job. Um, we can actually bring in one to test for hover capable or touch capable devices. So in this case, my behavior here, because I'm on a device that is touch or not touch capable, is that I have a transition in place on these little Ellie avatar elements. And that transition is helping me to create a larger, in WCAG terms, a larger pointer target size, right? So, but on a touch device, it would be difficult to select that middle one or that first one. So we're going to employ this media query that says that um, that's actually what's being applied so that on my non-touch device, this transition works. But my default behavior, if I switch to mobile emulation, is just to set the width with none of the overlap. So this allows us, again, to make that touch target size the appropriate size, make sure those elements are accessible, um, like being able to actually touch them um, without, uh, without that overlap that is present when a user has, as it says, a fine pointer. The alternative to this is a coarse pointer. So, something like this is still going to be, say use a little bit with caution. Um, this is a, very small, very contained example. Um, and sometimes it might be still appropriate to couple this with viewport units. But as you can see, like viewport units alone, that's not going to tell you that this really critical information about the size of the device they're using to access your interface. And then similarly, that transition is happening on hover. And as we know, hover on a mobile is going to get kind of stuck in that state or maybe not even trigger at all. Um, so nice little enhancement here. This is again on small CSS as the avatars. I'm using a little, I cheated a little bit on the technique. The one over there is a lot nicer. But I wanted it to fit within my code sample in this case. Okay. Any more questions? Oh yeah, tablets have larger screens, exactly. Or I have a Microsoft Surface. So if I, yeah, take that off, or maybe I'm using both in that case, which can be interesting too. So in that case, that's why the any hover part is important. So it knows that I'm, when that's attached, it still has hover capabilities because it assumes that I still have a trackpad or a mouse available. So it would still continue to use this behavior, even though the device is um, touch capable. Cool. Oh, I zoomed in. Cool. Let me, our last thing is styling. And I think I'll only do the first example, which will be really quick. And then we can kind of wrap up. I know it's we're right at an hour and a half. So I know it's a lot to sit and take in a lot of new information. um, but this is one of the things that, again, like I'm pretty pumped about it being in native CSS. So you, again, may already know where I'm going to go with this because I have a list on the page. To reset over here. So again, another one where I've done a variety of hacks over my career on lists that when I just want to change the color of the list bullet. And we officially have that available to us in CSS with a new selector, pseudo selector of marker. And so let's look at my selector here real quick. So obviously I'm inside the UL. You could be explicit and attach this to the LI. We can safely drop that as well. But there's a few properties we can apply. We'll start with color. Just gonna choose a named color here. So using just marker alone, we can now change the color. And that in itself is pretty amazing, pretty powerful upgrade to have now. Marker is unique in that it only allows a select few properties. Notably, we can't change a background color, we can't add transform or any other positioning properties, which does still limit it from other solutions. But we can do things like adjust the font size. And I'm going to use another kind of newer unit called the EX unit, which matches the X height. Um, and you can see that when I, kind of a gotcha here, is that when I adjust this, it's not going to keep it positioned center, which is a little baffling to me. I need to research what the reason is that it doesn't keep it kind of centered to the first line would be ideal in my view. So that it makes it, again, as I said, a little limiting. If that alignment was important to you, then you would want to fall back probably to a before, or again, I have an article on this yeah, grid solution that I've used with a before element. But still, we can get a decent ways here. And the other property that it accepts is the content property. So just for fun, we can throw in an emoji as our bullet instead. So just fun to play around with. Notable thing is that if we change the display property of our list items, then marker no longer exists because it's only attached to list items. Interestingly enough, if you define display list item on another element, it will gain a marker pseudo element. So another tiny gotcha there, but still even just for this behavior, pretty useful. I'm actually using marker here on the home page to adjust my ordered list numbering. So you can see it also takes on a font style. I have font style italic there. So I think that the other ones I'm afraid would take more time than we want to continue sitting here. They're just minor ones. They're kind of bonus anyway. Um, so definitely open to questions, discussion. I think feel free to unmute too if you have kind of a question that way as well. I'm happy to revisit any of the demos.